Hello and welcome back to another episode on my tutorial series on how to program in C#. Now today we're going to be doing for loops, but before we do that there is one little thing that I need to show you, so I'll show you that now, and that is iterators. So we can just delete this code that we've written in our main loop. Of course you don't have to, but I will do for now. And I'll delete this up here as well, so just keep your main loop, your main function, static void main, and the class program. Now to show you about iterators, I'm first just going to create an example variable that's going to be of type int, so int example, and we'll just say it equal to anything. I'll say equal to 5, you might want to say it equal to something else, I don't know. And then it's giving me examples again, don't want to follow that. Now what if you wanted to say just increase example by 1? Well, one thing you could just say is example equals example plus 1, just like it was suggesting there, and that would definitely work. And if we tested that, then by the end of this example would be equal to 6, because it's just increased it by 1. It's literally just said example equals the current value of example plus 1. Nice and straightforward. But there is another way we can do that with iterators. So if I say example, literally all you have to do is write plus plus, and then of course end the line with a semicolon. And if you just say example followed by plus plus, that is shorthand for saying plus 1. So now if we said console.write line example, and run the program, it should be equal to 6 because we're setting equal to 5, and then this plus plus just says add 1 to example, and there you are, it's 6. Nice and simple. And you can also do minus minus, so we're setting equal to 5, and it's minus minus literally takes away 1, so we should end up with 4, and there you have it, that is 4. And the final thing we can do is say if you wanted to increase it by 2 or 3 or any other number, what you can do is say example plus equals and then an amount. So let's say 3. It literally just increasing the value of example by 3. There you are, it's 8. And you can do anything else. You can do minus, you can do multiply, you can do divide, which is a slash, and all of them work. You could do a modulo, which you probably don't understand at the minute, is basically getting the remainder of a division. Let's just go with divide. We should get 1. Now, if you're wondering why is it 1? Why is it not like a specific value? Obviously 5 divided by 3 wouldn't just be 1, it'd be point something. That's because it's an int, and ints can't store decimal. So if we change that to a float, there you are, it's actually 1.6 recurring, it looks like. The main thing really is just that plus plus or minus minus. That's what we're going to be using in our for loops. Right, so now let's actually start talking about how we'd write a for loop. So you'll see I've made a lovely little slideshow here about the structure of a for loop. So let's just get into it. Now first, what is a for loop? Well, it's literally just a block of code which is repeated again and again until a condition has been met. And you'll obviously see all of these things in a second. But here's where we get into iteration, because every time the for loop goes around, we iterate a variable that we create. And then we can use the current value of that variable, because obviously it's going to change every single time the for loop goes round. So we can use the current value of that variable inside our for loop to get a different result every time the for loop goes around, because obviously if inside our for loop we're saying that variable multiplied by 3, then, well, the first time it's going to be 0 and get 0, but then it's going to go around and it'll be 1, get 3, etc. So, anyway, that's enough of that. Let's actually see how all this works and how we write it. So we start by just writing 4 and a pair of brackets. You've seen the syntax loads, but this is where it gets strange. So you actually declare a variable inside our brackets, inside our for loop. So you'll just say we've created an integer, called it I, which just stands for index or iterator, and 99% of the time it will literally just call our variable I. Even the professional programmers 99% of the time just call their variable I inside our for loop, and also pretty much always set to 0 at the start. And then we have a conditional statement, so a condition, which is what we were looking at last time with if statements. And as long as this condition is met, the loop will continue to run and go round and round. And then finally we get to our iterator, because every time the loop goes around the variable, so I is iterated, and in this case increased by 1, but of course we could use another statement, so like I plus equals 2 or something, or I minus minus, that still works. And then finally we just have a pair of curly brackets, and inside those curly brackets is the actual code that's executed or run every time the loop goes round. So pretty straightforward once you really get into what everything means. And really, if you've done iteration in maths, it's just the same concept, just a little bit easier, I'd say, because you don't need an iterative formula. Anyway, let's actually get into writing some of these in our project. So the first thing we'll do is say for, followed by a pair of brackets, and we said that first we create a variable that we're going to iterate, so int, and we pretty much always call it I, iterator, or index, and we'll set that equal to 0, and then we will say I is less than, and this is basically the amount of times we want the loop to go round, because it's literally just going to increase I by 1 each time if that's what we tell it to do. And so it's just going to do that for a number of times until it's done it the amount of times say here, so let's say 5, so it will do it 5 times, and then we'll say I plus plus to increment it by 1 each time, and then we'll create a pair of curly brackets, and anything or the code inside these curly brackets will run every time our for loop goes round. So I'll just say console.writeLine I for now. And so now what we should see is that it goes around the first time, it says it's I is equal to 0 the first time, and so it will write 0, then it goes around this, it increases I by 1, and goes around the second time, so I is now 1, and it's going to write 1, then it goes around the third time and the fourth time, but eventually it's going to say, oh well, I is 5 now, so we've got to stop, and then it will literally just leave this for loop and it won't repeat again, and any code after the for loop will be executed. So then we could say console.writeLine end. And that is an important thing to note, that once we enter a for loop, the for loop has to go round all the times before any code after the for loop can run. So think about your code like a list of instructions. It's going to do this for loop first, and then it will do the next one. It can't do them at the same time. That's threading, a bit complicated. But there you are, it did what we expected. So you'll see it did it 5 times. That's 5. The first time it was 0, and it did it each time till it was 5, and then it stopped and we got to the end. Perfect. And to be honest, that's basically for loops. And you can literally do anything in here. You can create variables in here if you want, or whatever. Just you can do if statements. Anything we've talked about is absolutely fine, apart from functions. You can't create a function inside another function, but we can write line I times by 3, and we should get the 3 times table this time, for example, 3, 6, 9, 12, because each time it'll be 1 times 3 and then 2 times 3. I think you hopefully understand. There is one last thing that I'd like to show you with for loops, so that gets a tiny bit more tricky, and it's called nested for loops, and that's literally just when we have a for loop inside another for loop. And it's a bit tricky to get your head around to start with, but it all just revolves around the idea that the computer cannot execute any code after our for loop, or it cannot run any code after our for loop before it's run our for loop. So I'm actually going to set this equal to x, our variable in our first for loop, so make sure you change all three of those. And then I'm getting inside this for loop, I'm going to create another for loop, and this time our variable will be y, and y less than, let's just do 5 again, y plus plus. And so now we've got a bit of a weird scenario. So what we could say is console.writeLine in here x, and we're going to write line console.writeLine y. And what you should realise is that the first time x will go round, so actually I'm going to put write line x up here, sorry, and at the top of our the first for loop. And so what should happen is that it's going to set x equal to 0, and then it will do console.writeLine 0, because x is obviously 0, but then it's going to enter another for loop, which is our while loop, and it's going to run all our while loops, so it's going to go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 before it can then go on to the next iteration of our x loop. So just to make this a little bit more clear, I'll say x colon plus x and y colon plus y to make it explicitly clear. And then you'll see that first we started with x, so we started with x equals 1, and then we did y, all our values of y, so y equals 1, 2, 3, whatever. So it's run all of that loop before it then goes on to the next iteration of our x loop, x equals 2, and oh, I'm missing a bit up here, obviously it starts on 0, and then continues. The thing to note really is just that this loop will run entirely before the next iteration of x, and then of course this loop will run entirely every time x is iterated. Hopefully I haven't confused you too much with nested for loops, but that's basically as tricky as for loops ever get, so brilliant. We'll see you in the next episode where we'll I'm not sure, we might even do classes, or we might do lists or arrays or something like that, but I'll see you then.